The purpose of today is to convene in the topic of designing in your district. We're excited. This is our second convening. As a reminder, we host this every month with different topics to support your work on commercial revitalization and essentially some of the SBS grants that you're on. We hope that all these skills that we impart during convenings are helpful to you and your organizations as you take some of this work. Um, you can go to the next slide. So, why does this matter? This is part of a bigger umbrella initiative that we have going on at SBS called Building Creative Capacity, where we're hoping to give you tools, um, perspectives, and materials to think about how to creatively tackle some of the projects that you're working on. So, why did we pick this topic of graphic design and overall design as being important in your work? We think that design is a great tool that you can use to activate your commercial corridors by boosting traffic and visibility to your local business. But as program managers, you're also doing work that requires a lot of design. You might be creating materials to advertise a meeting, a flyer for an event, a map to do a site visit. All this can be greatly impacted with good design principles and can really like hone in on the action that you're trying to get your community to do. Well-designed collateral, as it says here, contributes to more engagement, it grabs attention, and it helps you communicate clearly some of the goals that you're working on in your community. So I'm really excited to add this to your toolbox and talk about elements of good design and why design is so important in your work. Um, we can go to the next slide. So today, essentially, we've been partnering for this Building Creative Capacity initiative with Van Allen Institute, which believes that that local knowledge enriches the design process and that community engagement is essential for building resilient and just cities. Their work really is on the realm of supporting neighborhood organizations through interdisciplinary cross-sector public-private coalitions that really put design and public architecture at the forefront. So I'm really excited and happy that we get to partner with them this year. You'll hear a little more about what the Building Creative Capacity Program is, and particularly this new Design District Fellowship, which we have some of those fellows in the room here today. And then go on to a presentation on design. The presentation that's today will include a couple of activities and discussion questions. Please contribute as much as you can and engage with some of the activities that are planned. You can use the chat. We'll ask you to unmute and share your own expertise as well if you want. Again, the purpose of today is to just convene and share our expertise with each other. So please feel free and don't hesitate to come off mute and tell us what you think. With that said, I'll pass it along to Van Allen. I'll pass it along to Joseph, who is my partner in crime in this program, who I've been working with closely with. So, Joseph, take it away.
Thank you, Renee, and it's lovely to see everyone here. I want to thank the Department of Small Business Services for their continued partnership with Van Allen Institute. I'm Joseph Masana Curley, Program Manager here at Van Allen, and I work with Renee on initiatives to build creative capacity, including this workshop, which is organized as part of our work leading the District Design Fellowship, which, if you haven't heard about it, it's the newest initiative we have, and it's set to launch in November. And this program builds upon the work of our Building Creative Capacity program from last year, which allowed us to activate vacant storefronts. This time we're thinking a little bit bigger about both graphic design and urban design, and this workshop is set to give you those fundamental skills in graphic design. So that being said, if we could go to the next slide, I'm excited to see everyone here, but I want to give an especially warm welcome to our District Design Fellows. They join us from all corners of our city. They represent different corridors. They come from different backgrounds, but they all have one thing in common, which is that they're ready to jump in and learn about design, but also make a big impact on their communities. So we have Becca Brand, Preservation Associate at Landmark West. She's going to be working on 72nd Street in the Upper West Side. We have Evelyn Caballero Omana. She's the Neighborhood 360 Project Manager at La Colmena, working on Port Richmond Avenue in Staten Island. Very exciting. We haven't worked in Staten Island in a while. We have Jamila Diaz, Director of Community Development at Wedco, working on 161st Street in the Bronx. And last but not least, we have Quinn Moss, Community Liaison at Central Astoria LDC, who will be working on Steinway Street in Astoria, and she joins us as, I think, Marie on the Zoom today. But welcome to all of you, and I look forward to working with you in November. Let's go to the next slide. We have two wonderful speakers today. They're both longtime contributors at Van Allen Institute. And we have BD, who is on the left with the turtleneck. BD is a multidisciplinary designer and creative strategist with a focus on community-forward design, storytelling, and cultural preservation. He's based in the Bronx, and his practice integrates design, technology, and research to amplify underrepresented voices, challenge dominant narratives, and develop tools for a better world. I'll also say that BD has worked with us on several design sprints projects in the past. And in blue, we have Scott Kelly, who's a graphic designer with over 7 years of experience working with nonprofits and cultural institutions in New York City, including Van Allen Institute, the Clemente Center, and Cooper Square Committee.
Wonderful. So I think that hi everyone, BD here. Before we get started, I want to just go over the agenda a bit. Um, so you know, first and foremost, what brings me to design is my passion for helping communities, for problem solving, specifically underrepresented communities. As an immigrant and a Bronxite, I see design as a tool for change, and a lot of the issues that affect me and my community, I see as things we can tackle through design. Not sure, Scott, if you want to share any.
Yeah. So I mean, I find the process of graphic design super stimulating, and I like working with kind of the inherent constraints that are involved in that process. And yeah, I think it's nice to be able to work kind of in a community-driven way and feel that the labor that you're doing is both enjoyable, just the act of doing it, but also that it's in the service of something that feels worthwhile. So that's why I've tried to work in this in the way that VD and I are going to describe over the course of this presentation.
Great. So today, essentially, what we're going to be doing is we're going to go through these items here. This shouldn't feel too much like a lecture. It's more like just a conversation amongst all of us. We're all here to learn and to see ways in which design can be used to like push forward. We're going to start by looking at what is design, essentially, you know, what do we mean when we say design? How do we understand it in general? And then more specifically, how do we understand graphic design and what is graphic design? Also, why it matters. We'll go from there to seeing design in practice, several real world examples, and then we will have a 10-minute break or so. Folks want to get coffee, tea, just get some fresh air, what have you. That'll be that moment for that. Then when we get back, we'll dive into how we can integrate design into the process, into our process, into the work that we're already doing or the work that we're interested in doing, and that will then we'll share some tools that folks can use for designing. We will have some Q&A throughout, so we don't necessarily have to wait till the end, but there will be specific moments that there'll be like Q&A. And as Renee had mentioned, there will also be some activities along the way as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a sampler of like some of what the activities are going to look like. When you think of design, what's something that springs to mind, essentially? Like very briefly, it could be a word, it can be a lot more than that. When you think of the design or the word design, what comes to mind? And if folks can add it to the chat, that would be like super helpful. Murals, okay, action. I'll just read it as folks type it. Visuals. Okay, design is communication. I love that one. Creativity, colorful. Graphics, banner, personal. Efficiency, that's a good one. Buildings. How to make something complex sound or look clearer and concise. Storytelling, beautiful. Okay. All right. Okay, well, let's move on to the next slide. Thank you all. Everything that was shared is like spot on in a way. Okay, so like what is design? Like a quick search will tell you that like design is the intentional, I'll read it. Design is the intentional shaping of experiences, systems, and messages to make something better for people. Now, depending on who you ask, what design is, the definition will vary. But for our purposes, we'll just say that, which, our purpose is to push communities forward. We'll say that design is the intentional process of organizing and planning ideas to solve a problem or communicate something meaningfully. Where art can be something that's random and full of like just beautiful mistakes, design is something that is intentional and generally we're looking to achieve something. Next slide, please. With graphic design, more specifically, the outcome is most often improving communication, drawing attention to something, or moving people to action. Um, Graphic design is essentially how we see things and understand them, whereas general design is more so focused on like how things are used or experienced. Um, and why does graphic design matter? It helps to make information more understandable and accessible. And a lot of these points are things that y'all have already shared, right? So it helps make information understandable and accessible. If you look at, for example, a store is closed, but they're going to only be closed for 15 minutes. It's useful to have that information in a way that folks are able to see it when they pass by the store and understand that. So that's something we can do with design. It builds trust and perceived uh, reliability. I don't know how many of y'all like Nathan's hot dogs, but like if you go to Coney Island, you're in Coney Island because of like the signs, and you see Nathan's, and the signs are like in your face, and that's something that like builds a level of like trust of like, okay, it's Nathan's, there's going to be a specific flavor, a specific like experience associated with that because of the consistency, and that's something that was like thought out and planned out. It can be used to promote inclusivity and culture. If you see on that third image there, where they have like, this was taken in Stockholm, where they have their like crossings, and they have what looks like a female figure crossing the street, and it just goes to show you how you can use design to create like inclusivity, to create a space for pretty much for everyone. And it's also something that can be used to drive people to take action. I mean, when you look at posters, sometimes the message itself just moves you to want to take action. I really love the image there. There is no planet B. And I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Scott. I'm not sure if he wants to add any other words on this, or yeah.
No,
Otherwise,
I mean,
we'll.
I would say that design, we're at a moment now where people have more access to the tools of graphic design, and those tools are more accessible than they've ever been before. And so kind of more people are positioned as image makers or designers, what have you, than at any other point really in human history. And so like with the ease of use of some of these tools, or increasing ease of use, um, I would say kind of the intentionality actually becomes even more important, because it's the only way that you really kind of cut through just the massive imagery that gets produced and that people get exposed to. And so that's kind of as BD was saying, kind of the intentionality is kind of a core, like a spine of what distinguishes something that feels designed and part of some kind of broader system versus something that was just made because people have the ability to make it. And then kind of we thought a good way to illustrate how kind of design unfolds is to have sort of a case study. Um, so what we have here is initial kind of designed materials from an organization called the Gowanus Oversight Task Force. So as some of you may know, Gowanus, the neighborhood of Gowanus has kind of undergone massive changes in the past 2 years because it got rezoned. And so there's been a huge influx of high density building that's happening there. And so this task force was created as kind of a citizen advocacy group that was meant to ensure that remind the developers of the promises they made to the neighborhood in which they are now developing and now have access to, and try to keep them kind of honest about promises that were made. So this is kind of the early. I worked with them on kind of creating a brand identity that would infuse their website and their promotional materials of like either presentations at meetings, how they draw people to meetings or make people aware of things that are happening, and then the website as kind of a platform for displaying a lot of that information. But this is what they made this is kind of the stuff they were making prior to working when prior to when I came on the scene. And we just thought it's kind of helpful to show a kind of before, because it goes back to this idea of, people now, you have the means now to make imagery like this with relatively easily from a technical perspective. Um, but we wanted to ask people if what their takeaways were from this imagery, and whether, if they're, what kind of a leading question, honestly, what can be improved here? Maybe people like this, I'm not sure. But if anyone, feel free in the chat to think if there's what kind of feelings this imagery provokes, or if it's enticing enough to make you want to join one of these meetings. All right. Okay, you guys are giving the scripted answers I sent you, so that's good. But yeah, I think people have, it's fine. It doesn't, there are issues with information hierarchy and aesthetics. Yeah, so there was a lot to kind of work through. There was a lot that needed to be conveyed in these digital pamphlets and these flyers and things like that. Um, so I work with them on kind of a rebrand. This is like a word that you'll hear a lot, on creating kind of an identity that can then be infused into all elements of the materials that they produce as an organization. So starting with this logo, and this kind of more vibrant color palette, and this logo is kind of playing with you have the organization clearly written, and then you have this kind of lowercase g on its side, that's also kind of this watchful owl or glasses, or it's constantly, it's in motion to be dynamic. Um, and it's kind of alluding to this idea of oversight. And yeah, so it's kind of stripping down the information, having kind of a clearer hierarchy in terms of how it's conveyed. And then obviously you have, motion as something that kind of uh, livens it up. And the goal of all this imagery is to make people show up in person, or make people care about these issues that are kind of at the forefront of the oversight committee, of the task force. And so that's kind of what was underpinning this rebranding. But kind of just as important, you have this kind of polished design materials. Was to give them, and BD and I will talk about this. This will be kind of another recurring theme of the presentation, is to give them tools that they can use when the designer is no longer kind of on call, so to speak. And so uh, here's an example of things that they were able to make kind of with the constraints of that I developed with the organization, but they were able to make kind of independently of my engagement. So this was kind of created in pamphlets that I worked with them on to ensure that they were as usable. I mean, not pamphlets, templates that I worked with them on to ensure that they were as usable as possible. And, just try to ensure that all of their kind of public facing communications were kind of infused with a coherent identity that tied all the visuals together. So ideally, someone seeing an image and then seeing another one a couple weeks time would kind of start to make visual connections for themselves and start to understand more clearly what the task force was advocating for. Again, so what we have here is like, it's not, these are screenshots from their Instagram. It's maybe not as sexy or polished as kind of these launch materials. There's no motion or things like that. And so that's just kind of a reality, and it's kind of the job of the designers to create tools that allow the organizations to create things that have as much fidelity to the identity that's been crafted as possible. And there is like inevitable trade-offs, but I think that's kind of a key component of the design process, and that's what I think any organization participating in one of these programs should aspire to emerge with, is both the kind of big splash, like fun, attention grabbing, polished professional feeling graphics, that kind of help launch something or help kind of bring a lot of immediate attention to something, but also the tools to then kind of continue on with that new identity that's been forged in a way that ensures a degree of longevity or staying power. All right, and then BD is going to kind of build off this idea of branding.
Yeah. So just as my colleague Scott had mentioned, branding is something that we can look at as a tool that organizations and organizers, folks in general, can use to really like push forward, and it's something that it can be like reused. You can express it in different ways. This is from a project that I worked on last year with an organization called Rematriation RD, which is focused on Dominicans across the diaspora and helping them like reacclimate back into the maternal lands, invest and whatnot. And it's a clear example of just how something like branding can be used to create consistency and to really create a sense of community for an organization and the folks that are engaging with them. We collaborated with them on branding and developing guidelines, as you can see on the like left there, that first image. Really, because they needed a culturally relevant and welcoming way to present their brand, their organization, the work that they do, which is very important. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And it's really the tool here in the case of this project was designing, besides like the branding itself, the guidelines, the book, the brand book, which is a useful tool in general. Really setting the like do's and don'ts, and this is something that working with a designer is able to create for an organization, where the organization might not necessarily have a designer for like the whole year. They could collaborate with a designer for a specific project, which might be, in this case, developing a brand book, and set those guidelines and really work to create something that then they're able to replicate over time. If you can go back to the previous slide. So the last image there, which says Casa Tierra Liberación, right? That was an Instagram like stories post, and that was something that was created using the guidelines, and something that they, in many ways, kind of curated in a way. We developed a lot of different components with them in this collaboration, but for example, like icons. Icon is something that we developed in this collaboration, and that they were able to use in different ways. Just being able to use custom icons for different things. That was something that we were able to do. And yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Scott. I think for
Yeah, I think they also with these brand books, like the idea is that they're supposed to be as useful as possible, and so it's kind of the scope of something like this, of these guidelines, is kind of dictated by the resources of an organization, I think. And so a small organization that's just one or two people, maybe a 30-page document that has all these hyper-specific scenarios of what to do and what not to do, maybe is kind of excessive or unnecessary, or even at worst, kind of like counterproductive. So a brand book or guideline can be as simple as, this is your 3-color scheme, this is your logo, and this is a typeface or font. Or it can be something, much more elaborate if the situation calls for it. So I think it's important to note that like, designers sometimes will have an impulse to just like develop something, they get kind of revel in the process and get lost in kind of creating as many images and scenarios as possible. But I think it's important that if you're working on a branding with a designer, that what you a takeaway from that should be kind of tailored to be as useful for you as an organization as possible. And that's not going to be the same for every organization. All right, so we talked a bit about branding as that's kind of an umbrella concept. Now we can go more specifically into how that manifests, like in certain platforms or in certain mediums. Let me share. So this is this is kind of the website that I built for that organization I had just touched on. I'm going to share. Uh, Not that one. All right, everyone can see this website. Yes.
You're good.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a kind of an extension of that brand identity that I work with them on. A website is kind of where a lot of this stuff ends up living. Um, and again, it's made within Squarespace, so using a tool that's meant to be accessible as possible for a non-designer, but it's a matter of kind of how is that tool harnessed or sculpted to best kind of feel like as unique to the organization as possible. And digital design is kind of a reality of it's ends up taking the bulk of what most designers do. And a website is kind of a really fundamental way of elevating your organization. And so if that website, even if it's made, on a platform that is kind of lends itself to templates, and a lot of these websites end up looking the same because they're merging from these same platforms. It's a matter of working with the designer to make sure that those platforms are used kind of in a way that best serves the organization and feels kind of a piece with this broader identity that is being sculpted. All right. Um, okay, do people see the presentation again? Okay.
Yes, it's back.
Yes.
Um,
Uh, Yep. Well, this is an example of a website that I worked on with La Escuela Comunitaria del Bronx. It's a preschool. Um, Honestly, I feel like you touched on most of the points I had to make, Scott. So I'm not gonna well, I guess I'll reiterate that. Like, yes, um, websites are a space, and like digital design is a way in which we are able to express design and the work that we do. Um, in this example here, I think the thing for me was like showing how branding can be like translated across different platforms and media. Like uh different designers will design in different ways, and sometimes you might design something that's specifically geared towards like print, especially if the organization doesn't have too much stuff going on online. But if it's clearly defined and developed, then it's something that can translate easily on web, and really just become an extension of the work that is already happening in other spaces. You can actually move to the next slide. These are posters that I worked on as well last year, I believe. Yes, last year, with Van Allen, the design sprints, working with equality for Flatbush. Um, we developed these posters essentially because Equality for Flatbush needed volunteers for their community rapid responders program. They stressed to us how important it was that the campaign not only looked culturally like relevant, but also translated the work that they do in an empowering and bold way. Early on, they mentioned to us like, you know, we're a neighborhood collective. We're grassroots. We're essentially by the people for the people. We don't want to be treated as this like nonprofit entity. And so it was important to communicate it in a way that felt like good enough for them, but still clear and having a hierarchy. And I think that when it comes to this project, something that was very important was like the messaging, right? So we spent a lot of time working on this, like calmness and kindness de-escalates violence, neighborhood organization instead of displacement, and like really collaborating on finding that perfect balance. And that is essentially, something that you get out of design is like folks coming together, collaborating and figuring out like how can we communicate information in a way that is going to have impact, but still feels like grounded and rooted in the work that we do. Next slide, please. And here's another example. This one was with the Office of the Bronx Borough President. Shout outs to all of y'all in the Bronx or from the Bronx. um, this was the project was a report that we worked on about establishing a birthing center here in the Bronx, which is something that's very complicated and also, uh, you know, a bit touchy depending on who you talk to, because it deals with, maternal more, deaths essentially. And one of the biggest issues we have here, which is the fact that like Black women here and you know Latino women face a higher risk of like maternal like deaths compared to any other type of women essentially. And it was very important for us from throughout to find a way to make the information digestible, and not feel so heavy, because there are like a ton of statistics that do feel scary. And one cool aspect about this project, was, if you look on the left there, the images, we that was the references. Rather than having, there's a report, so obviously there's going to be a level of like seriousness and like academia to it. But we wanted to make something like looking at the references for the report as accessible as possible. So rather than having like the long URLs, we decided to go with like QR codes, which if you scan takes you to like the article or whatever the statistic is, which is super helpful. And that just goes to show you the power of design and what you're able to do with it, and how it's not only about like just creating something beautiful, but like but about creating something that's intentional and seeking to solve a problem or to improve communication in some sort of way. Um, yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is back to you, Scott.
Yeah, so I think it's important that print doesn't become an afterthought when you're kind of developing a new design system, and it the primacy of print versus digital, I think, will be determined by what kind of audiences you're trying to reach, and it's important to keep into account that certain people are going to be reached more effectively on one platform versus another, and that if print is something that needs to be a component, then that informs the design. So the design, there's certain colors that you're just in your office printer are just not going to be able to create. Or if the design is heavily predicated on motion, something like that's not, how are you going to translate that to print? So I think these are all examples of flyers that I did for Van Allen, and they were printed. The color was achieved through colored paper or paper that has this kind of gradient, whereas the printing itself is fairly basic and just something that can be done at home. But the colored paper was a means of kind of elevating it and making it kind of more professional and eye-catching. But the broader point is that, if you know that you need to reach people through print, or that print's going to be a fundamental element of how a design system manifests, and that has to be taken into account as you're creating that system. And ideally, you'll have something, be it a logo, things like that can kind of elegantly straddle the worlds of digital and design digital and print design simultaneously. All right, so we're kind of breaking these up with a question. If anyone has any questions or wants to call attention to anything, uh, raise your hand, I guess, in the chat, and Annie will.
Yeah.
And if we're good, we can also go on to the next activity. Or the first activity, second activity. Okay, good, Annie?
Good. It doesn't look like there are any questions yet, but we have another Q&A at the end. So if there are things that come up, just put them.
So it's just kind of activity. People can, again, this will be kind of you can either write in the chat or raise your hand and speak to it. But we're curious if in we initially restricted it to just your commercial corridor, but we can kind of expand it to more just broadly in terms of, all of us are interacting with design basically constantly in our lives. And we were just curious if there's any examples of businesses or organizations that are kind of in your vicinity, or just things that you encounter outside of your, working life that kind of you feel are examples of effective design.
I'm seeing a lot of like wayfinding and like street signs, direction signs.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the NYC kind of subway system is like a super kind of iconic example of design, because it's such a kind of a complex system that's being uh, synthesized, and it needs to be um, it needs to be something that's like immediately intelligible for somebody, and for a whole swath of people that are interacting with it. Um, the maps, Colombian restaurant. I have seen the Atlantic Ave banners. They have cool typography for sure. Um, but yeah, so like for example, like with this wayfinding stuff, I think that that's an instance where kind of cla I mean, clarity and messaging is kind of the core of all design, but in a wayfinding scenario, clarity takes on an added degree of importance because you're trying to direct people and to go in a certain direction or seek something out. And so if you need to create wayfinding, or which is kind of a fancy word for signage, directional signage, um, that is still kind of infused with some elements of a graphic identity. It's kind of this challenge of where do you kind of make that move? Maybe it's just color and the typography is super clear, or maybe there's one flourish, versus like something like a mural, which where you have like a little bit more leeway to be kind of more, slightly more expressive, and can definitely be more infused with, visual flourishes. So I think these are kind of good examples of, how the different kind of arenas in which design is playing. They each come with, a pretty wide range of constraints that you have to work with. And they're kind of distinct to their own arenas. And yeah, I mean, Jamila talked about eye pollution in the city, but that goes also to like anytime we're on a screen. We're just constantly bombarded with imagery, and so this is kind of the swamp that you and your designer are trying to cut through, and so it's kind of a daunting task, and you don't want to be someone that's kind of just contributing to this kind of visual overload. So, there's a lot to cut through, I would say. Um, do you have anything to add, BD, or should we give people?
No, no. I mean, I fully agree with everything.
One thing I find that intriguing, for me, I was gonna share something about like a small business that has a pretty awesome like branding and design presses on the street. So it reminded me what Philo shared about there being a restaurant that has like a strong branding and graphic design enough to like remember it. For me, there's a Chase Bank that recently moved. I live around the Bed-Stuy area on Nostrand Avenue, and they created this like window vinyls that um, it's like this colorful, community-based kind of murals on the window, and I thought it was just such a good, easy way to add to the street. I'm wondering if anybody else has like any businesses that you think are good at this in your districts that you look at for like good design. Yeah, I like that one too.
Their food's also amazing.
Lick Cleaners, LIC Cleaners. That's cool. Skate shop on Steinway as well. Yes, from 161st Street, I definitely see that connection between that Yankee sports and the businesses. Fair point on like some like the storefronts kind of looking the same and some of that standard design. I can, good point on thinking about how to make it different and unique.
Yeah, I think also what to Harry's point here, like I think there's a lot of these businesses end up a lot of these images are emerging out of kind of the same template, the same software, the same programs. And so that kind of generally fosters like a high degree of homogenization. And then also people are now it's so much easier to find inspiration and people get kind of fed, a lot of people get kind of fed the same inspiration and kind of the, understandable impulses like, okay, I see this place is doing well. Let me just try to replicate this aesthetic. And so you get this kind of narrowing and this kind of homogenization that happens. And so I think that's, these kind of accessible tools, say a Canva or something like that, like these are essential things that all of you will probably be using in some way or another. And so the challenge, if you work with a designer, is like, how can I use those tools to generate something that doesn't feel rote or the same, or just kind of like recycling these aesthetics. And so you have to kind of like, and a lot of times these tools, even like a Squarespace, they have these existing templates that they're trying to funnel you towards. And so it's a matter of how do you kind of like work, swim upstream a little bit with them and work kind of around some of these barriers that they're erecting without making your life so difficult that it's like the tools aren't usable anymore. And so I think this is kind of this tightrope that a lot of, needs to be walked of like the tools encourage a degree of sameness. So like, how do we work against that without limiting their accessibility to begin with?
Yeah, I think the wonderful part about all of this is that we're going to go exactly into that a little bit later, and just showing different ways that we're able to integrate design into our process and show how many folks can use the same tools but in different ways, and no two organizations are going to necessarily look the same way once they go through like the design process and start to break down like what is our audience, who are the people that we are serving, what issues do we have, and what does tackling that look like, and that's something we'll touch on a little bit later.
All right, should we give everyone a break here?
Yes, 5 minute break, I believe. It's coming.
I think it's 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, great. We'll come
Yeah,
back in
yeah,
10 minutes. Please don't leave us.
get some coffee and whatnot.
Yes. Well, thank you for participating.
Right, thanks a lot, Scott. Okay, so make sure. Okay, so before we took our break, we looked at what design is and what it can be used for, how we what role does design play in the work that we do and in pushing communities forward, and examples of that. So I'd like to take some time to talk a bit about how we can use the design process, or like the process of design, to collaborate and get things going. So the design process is essentially a structured way to solve a problem where we start from understanding the problem, move to creating a solution, and refine based on how like effective the solution was or is at solving the problem. It starts with scoping, which we use as a tool to identify who we're designing for and define our project goals. Then we move to the ideation phase, which is where we come up with ideas, where folks share different ways that they think that we can like achieve the goals that we've set in the scoping. And then the last two phases are implementing it. So like executing that design, bringing that idea, that solution to life, and then iterating from there, seeing what next steps we can take from there, ways that we can improve on that. And the examples that I wanted to share, if you can go to the next slide, please. So like one super important part of scoping, I would say, is um, like site visits. And this is a project that I worked on with the James Baldwin Outdoor Learning Center in design sprints last year. And a super like helpful part of us getting the ball rolling was going visiting them when they had really like a farmer's market. And I was able to take some photos and really get an understanding of not only like the work that they do, but how that impacts the community that they are like focused on. Because I was able to see the community there in person. So that's like something that I think is super beneficial when working with a designer for organizations, to make sure that designers are able to, like, if you do work in a specific neighborhood, for them to be able to come on site, take pictures, ask questions, and all of that is done early on, right? So in that scoping and understanding what are the problems and who are we essentially like fighting for, who are we designing for. And in the process of that site visit, I took a picture of some like flowers that they had there that were like super like sort of like significant to the community there in the gardens. And inspired by that, I like kind of color picked and sampled at the purple there in the flowers, and we use that to develop a branding, and then also the shape to create like icons and like our own like unique pattern, which you can see on the right. The end result was essentially a website, and we did some branding as well, some light branding. But all of that really came out of like just me going to the garden and us spending a day together, just like doing the work that they do. And that's something that is directly as a result of the design process of like setting the project up into like different phases, where you start from trying to understand, trying to gain an understanding, and then from there looking at like what can we do about this, like how can we connect more with people, how can we engage more. And so that then turned into essentially this collaboration and this project. And I'm not sure if you want to add anything, Scott, before we go to the next slide.
No, I'll just speak to another project of mine in the process that informed that. Um, Yeah, so I mean, I think the process is what determines the outcome, and so like the process is kind of, we talked before the break about this kind of sameness that's kind of pervading, or these sort of kind of like shallow aesthetics that feel just kind of maybe slapped on, or just not unique or specific to any of the situations which they're being deployed, and that those are emerging from there's no real process that from which those outcomes are emerging. It's just kind of like, this is what the software has fed me, or this is what I saw and I'm replicating it. So if you have a process that is, like BD said, like as site specific as possible and collaborative as possible, you're just setting yourself up to emerge with results that feel unique and true to what it is that you're trying to represent and who you're trying to represent. This was a project that I did on a previous design sprints. So under kind of the guidance of Van Allen, I was collaborating with Cooper Square Committee for this vacant storefront project. And so we were kind of activating this vacant storefront and you displaying these objects from local businesses, and then also giving kind of profiles of the local businesses and displaying this on these some of these storefronts. But we kind of used, emerging from spending time in the neighborhood, seeing some of these places, and you have this kind of existing visual language of the vacant storefront. So of the craft paper covering up the entryway and of the masking tape, these kind of like utilitarian basic materials. And so, through working with Cooper Square, we kind of hatched on this idea of like, okay, well, maybe we can use that visual vocabulary and harness it in a way to kind of be the means of displaying this information. And kind of that becomes the branding of the installation. So yeah, so everything, you know, that we took the kind of the blue of the masking tape, we put a ton of masking tape on. We used craft paper, but we printed with white ink on this craft paper. Um, and so, you know, what something kind of from a distance maybe just looks like another kind of boarded up storefront actually is kind of like a means of uh, displaying, you know, displaying this information. And you see here kind of these business profiles. Um, and, you know, the Lower East Fine East Village, there's kind of this punk zine tradition. And so that determined the typography and kind of this sort of like rougher around the edges, kind of grungier, you know, approach that we took. Um, so yeah, so these things emerge. You know, it's important to keep in mind when you're working with a designer and like, you know, their timeline is maybe hard to understand. Like you don't really know what they're doing when they're kind of like not, you know, when they're kind of off doing their work. It's important to just constantly keep in mind that everything that they are, if they're a good designer, everything that they're presenting to you is coming out of a process, and the color choices, the fonts, the materials, the visuals, like these things aren't just kind of emerging out of an ether. And so you know, there needs to be some time built into this process. And the more insights you have into the process, I think the more kind of equally satisfied both you and the designer will be with the outcome. And here again, so this is kind of translating some of those storefront installation elements into a printed company and kind of printed newsprint, so newspaper kind of texture magazine that we did. And so you're lifting the color schemes, lifting kind of this tape, rougher zine aesthetic, and applying it to like a printed thing. So again, so this is, you know, it's straddling multiple mediums, a large scale, you know, storefront, environmental, if you will, and then a smaller, you know, 11 by 17 booklet, but they're tied together through these kind of recurring elements. And, you know, all these elements are lifted from just kind of marinating in the place and collaborating directly with the organization. And BD is just going to speak to some. We're kind of transitioning now from the process to the kind of the tools, like what are kind of the nuts and bolts things at your disposal for ensuring that this process is as collectively effective as possible.
I want to stop you here, Scott, just for a second to give you a little shout out on that project that we worked on. So essentially, that was from last year's Building Creative Capacity. We work with Scott to activate that storefront in collaboration with Cooper Square. A lot of the materials that came out of that are available for you to look at and learn from. So we'll be sharing some of those strategic documents that outline what the design collaborations made and how they made it. One particular detail that I really loved from his project was it was called placeholders, and the font was created using the fonts of different businesses in the community. Was how you came with that logo for the project, which I thought was really cool. But just to give you a little shout out, and I'll be sharing more about this afterwards.
Yeah, I think there's a phenomenal project. Like, just everything from the like concept to the execution. I'm like, wow, like I wish we would have some of this stuff over here in my neighborhood. But you know, I want to talk a bit about like strategies for effective collaboration. Often we talk about, you know, the different things that we're able to create with design and how it can be used as a tool for transformation, but we don't spend enough time talking about like the logistics of like, you know, how should we work with designers? What does that collaboration look like? What is an actual design collaboration? And going into the details. So I like to spend a bit of time talking about that. Um, what I have here, I'll first start on the left. There is just examples of like uh, design sprints. This was like taken directly out of like you know, shout outs to Van Allen. The From our last year's design sprint, like planning and organizing, and it goes to show you how like meticulous it can be, and how the more clarity you have about the schedule and what's expected of everyone, the greater the outcome. Like some of the posters that I shared, or even the collaboration with the James Baldwin Outdoor Learning Center, that was like as a result of having clear guidelines early on, clear expectations, and really doing a phenomenal job with like scoping. On the right there, this is a document I created literally to share with y'all like very recently. And it's just a basic like project scope canvas that which will hopefully be available to y'all as well. Renee, I'll send it to you, or if it hasn't already been sent to you. But just a tool that you can use to scope, write what the project name is, get an determine what is the purpose of the project, key deliverables, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just one tool of many that you can utilize. But when it comes to working with designers, every designer has a different process, has a different way of doing things. Their schedule is different. I mean, same thing goes with organizations. Everyone has different schedules. Sometimes folks are working on multiple projects, and so that can be a hassle. But it's nevertheless always important to get that clarity in the beginning. And that's why I think that I'm putting a little bit extra emphasis on like scoping and making sure that like deadlines are set as early as possible, and that we're clear on the deadlines, that we're clear on the deliverables, like what's expected. Like, like it says there, not only like saying like what we hope to get out of this project or what we're creating is like a poster, but like what kind of poster? Is a print poster? What size poster? And like getting as specific as possible so that there isn't any confusion along the way. And I think like me and Scott, we had a whole conversation about this yesterday about like just different ways to collaborate. So I'm not sure, Scott, if you want to chime in on this, and maybe we can go back and forth with it.
Yeah, well, I say just on these sorts of tools, like having some sort of kind of predetermined cadence for meetings and this kind of scope, even if it's not like a super nicely designed thing like this, even if it's just like a bare bones document, but just having some sort of like anchoring system, because it's like inevitable that things are going to go off script, and like things are going to arise that are kind of like destabilizing to the process. And so it's really helpful to have these sorts of kind of foundations that you can then, both you and the designer can then refer back to a month in, 2 weeks in, 6 weeks in, and kind of just make sure that you're kind of both on track, or that if the product has evolved, that it's kind of a mutual understanding of that evolution. So just having this like in writing and records of like, oh, we said we were going to meet every Friday, or like we said this was a goal and we're kind of off that. Just having these kind of foundational records is super useful for just trying to stay on track as much as can be aspired to. And then yeah, I think more broadly, I mean, I think Van Allen, rightfully and SBS are like rightfully kind of triumphing, a process that's as collaborative as possible. And I think BD and I both like derive enjoyment from that. And I think like that's kind of the pathway to the most successful results. But I think it's just important to note that like collaboration is not kind of a uniform process. And so I think there can be some impulse to think like, oh, collaboration means like we have like 3 meetings a week, or like the organization is like gonna get I'm gonna get feedback on like every single decision I make, and we're gonna have a whole kind of conversation with every organization about it. And that may not always be the case. I mean, sometimes there needs to be a strategic underpinning to like how you approach collaboration, and more isn't always the answer, because it can be kind of self-defeating. And so that's kind of like another thing that needs to be kind of, again, that will evolve with the course of the process, but that needs to be kind of communicated both from the organization and the designer, is like, how can I as a designer prepare you, position you as the organization to best give feedback and feel like you're part of this process, and how can you as the organization best convey to me as the designer like where you trust me to kind of make some decisions versus where you want to be kind of like fully involved in the process. And then also, yeah, it's like even you as individuals, you'll have different kind of tolerances for this process, or like interests in engaging with it. So I think there's kind of an interpersonal level of like understanding how much is too much versus when are you not collaborating enough. Yeah, I think that if the collaboration or the commitment to collaboration becomes burdensome, then you've kind of defeated the purpose of it. So I think that just needs to be and that's a learning process. But I think that that's kind of a key understanding of it's not always more, because it can kind of stymie the process to a degree that like no one wants to see.
Yeah,
But
and I think just to add on to that, it's just understanding that like the process is like what you and the designer or whoever you're collaborating with like define like and what that looks like, what that collaboration looks like. It's like up to you. There is not like one universal way of like doing things necessarily. Even like when I introduced the design process, like that is something that is intended to be like redesigned in a way that works for you. And like if there's too much that's like in a way it's better to design something or to create or do a project in a way that's like achievable rather than like setting these big goals and like all of this big stuff and like never being able to achieve it because there's too much going on. And so like that's something that it's be open to that. And also just a quick thing on the idea that like um what that collaboration looks like is up to y'all, but also understanding that like design is a process and it is also a collaborative process. um I think that a lot of times when I think of examples of like not necessarily bad design, but like not the best design, it's usually when there's a level of like detachment where you have like the designer is providing a service and organization or client is sort of just like receiving the service, but it's sort of like handing it off. And I think that the difference with what we're talking about here is that like you never really fully like just let go of like whatever the problem is. It's like the problem is now you've brought in a designer as a tool, as a resource to help with that, but like it's still a shared problem and it's still things that we work on collaboratively. And what that looks like depends on y'all. And yeah. And
Yeah, just one final note also, if you as the non-designer are integrated into the design process on mutually agreeable terms, you will feel like you have more ownership over the design that emerges from that process versus like this kind of purely transactional thing that BD is describing. It's kind of, the classic like being given fish versus being taught how to fish kind of metaphor of like if you feel like you've been part of the creation of this thing, when it's kind of handed off to you, you feel like it's something that you can use versus something that's just kind of been given to you because you understand what kind of informed its creation to begin with. So I think BD and I both like we want to prioritize like whatever design emerges from this your collaboration is then something that is usable for you and kind of continues to evolve. It's not just this static baton that's been passed to you. It's like something that you then kind of sculpt or continue to kind of adapt and develop. And I think you're just more inclined to do that if you've been integrated into the process in a way that feels good for both you and the designer. Um, all right, BD is going to talk to you then about some even more like nuts and bolts tools about where you can get stuff from for creating designs.
yeah, more specifically, it's so I'm gonna just try to not take up the most time as possible to just go over just different tools and resources that are available either at like low or no cost that you can use to to essentially design. I often when we think of a designer, we think of like a professional designer. There's very specific qualifications and like knowledge and things like that. But like as we've been talking about, design it's a process and it's something that can be collaborative. And for me, I think the goal with this particular section is for everyone to understand that like you can also be a designer. Like we all design in different ways, in different capacities, and how we show up within the aspect within design may be different, but we can still participate in it. So that's why it's like design is for everyone, right? And like one way that we can which also talks back to how to create a more unique identity when like storefronts, for example, start to look the same, is like fonts and type. You know, it's there are different ways to say what you're saying as far as like the information, how you're presenting it. There are different ways to present it visually, whether you want to make a be bold, whether you want to have something a little bit more light. When you think about like luxury brands, for example, they tend to have a very specific kind of style of like fonts that they use and type, and that's representative of the type of entity that they are. And so one of the tools that's the example here is Google Fonts. This is a free resource, essentially, like any of the fonts on their platform for the most part. You can use for free. You can download, and they're essentially like royalty free, so you're not going to have any like copyright issues with them necessarily. And there's also the League of Movable Type. There are other foundries as well, other websites that you can visit, other places to get different fonts. But just thinking that you have this as a resource, it could be, a logo can be something very thought out. It might, an improvement can be like just changing the font of how the name is spelled out, and doing it in a specific way that makes you feel a certain way. And this is something that's like totally free that you can use like right away to like start that. Next slide, please.
And I will say just one plug for Google Fonts. I mean, it can like being like beholden and like in the clutches of Google, like maybe doesn't always feel great. But I
Yeah,
will
that's
say
true.
that if you can, a benefit of Google Fonts is like if you're creating presentations in Google Slides or documents in Google Docs, the whole kind of Google stratosphere, all those fonts are also accessible there. So it can
Mm.
help you kind of build a uniformity across different platforms. So if people see that presentation, a flyer has this font, and then they go to the event and the presentation has kind of the same font, it's like another layer to kind of an identity that is being built. So Google, because it's such a big entity, it does offer that dexterity.
Yeah, yeah, and for sure, as far as like not everything is in Google, but it's a great resource. There are other ones out there as well. Like definitely, I think when the intention exists of like we want to do this, we want to have our own font that we use for our branding, even if it's just like light branding. Then it becomes much easier to find these resources, and you realize how it doesn't really require too much to make these small changes that ultimately have a lasting impact, as far as like being able to present information in a way that's consistent, that people can relate to and say like, okay, I know that this is this organization. Just of something as simple as like the type of font that they use and the style of like type that they have. um, Okay. Another great resource, color, right? Like color is super important when it comes to branding, and when it comes to how organizations and individuals and businesses present themselves. It can be used to, make a bold statement, to also make something more accessible. And a great resource that I personally use often is Coolers, which you can use to develop color palettes. They have a color palette generator, and another neat thing about Coolers is also the contrast checker. This is something that I've dealt with for the longest, partially living in the Bronx. We see it all the time, and for many different reasons. But like sometimes you'll see a poster that has like one color like type, and then the background clashes against that, and so it becomes harder to read. And sometimes colors might be used for just simply for many different reasons. The folks behind the design might just personally like those colors, and so they're using it. But it can become an issue when it comes to like visually seeing it. Like if you have a, a poster with a very that's like on a white background with a very light color text, it's going to be very hard to read, especially at a distance. And so that's something to take into consideration, and something that a tool like Coolers is like helpful at like preventing. When you access the contrast checker, it shows you exactly how that information is going to look against a specific background. And it's like I said, low to no cost. They do have like subscriptions and things like that, but like there's a ton of resources you can use on there like for free. And besides that, also like Adobe has it, Canva has it. A lot of these other like platforms have it already integrated. Like most of the design tools that we'll like talk about, like Canva, for example, like have this stuff built in. And so that's beneficial. But it's again, it's about thinking that about this stuff in a design way of saying like, okay, like it matters to us how information is presented, and it matters to us that people are able to like receive the information. Like it's not sufficient to just put out the information. We also care that like people are able to see it from like across the street. If we know that this is, if it's like in a storefront, for example, like a poster in a storefront, you it's important that that folks are able to see it, and color impacts that in a big way. um
And then also something to keep in mind with color is that you know, the colors you can see on screen, it's just a far wider spectrum than what you're able to print. So if you know that you're going to be needing to print a lot of materials, especially with the knowledge of like that the most cost-effective way to do that, if you'd be printing that in-house in your office printer or your home printer, just know that you know, your color palette needs to take that into consideration, because like the lime green that you see on your computer screen is just not going to translate to color, to printed format. So either you have to achieve that with colored paper or some way, or you need to kind of select a palette that you know, and then this is where working with a designer helps, but where select a palette that can then be translated or rendered in kind of a printed form as well as on screen. And then yeah, with both color and type, like it's a, you know, it's a wide world. Like there's so much to choose from, and it is like people will profess that there's like a science to it and things like that, and there are references, as we've talked about, that inform your choices there. But there is a subjective quality to it, and I would say don't hesitate to like convey your subjectivity on this matter to the designer, because if it's a good designer, then they should welcome any kind of constraints that you're imposing on them. So it can be kind of liberating to kind of narrow down choices. So if you say like, oh, I'm really committed to this shade of red because of XYZ, don't be hesitant just because like you're the organization, they're the designer. You know, don't discount your what you can contribute to that process in your own kind of subjectivity in contributing to it. And the designer, you know, if you have a good rapport, they should be receptive to it, and ultimately it should be kind of liberating in a way.
And speaking to the point about like the colors that are translate for or don't translate for like print from digital, um, these tools also help with that in the sense that they're able to present you with like if you put in a specific color, you can even like upload an image and it can specifically like pinpoint the colors within that image, and it'll show you like you know the translation of that on print version versus digital version and so on. It might not necessarily be the same exact, but it'll be like an approximation, like as close as possible. So like that's also something to keep in mind. That like certain things that you see online will look very differently in print. And sometimes you do need tools like this in order to make that like translation, that conversion. Photography. This is like probably the most slept on tool. Photography and videography. Myself as a photographer as well, storyteller. Um, Photography is like something that there's so many levels to it, honestly, that I feel like we could do a whole presentation on it. But like let me try to like paint a picture here when it comes to design. You can say a lot through a photo. Like this is like a quote, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. And sometimes it's not necessarily like uh let's say you're working on an ad, it's not necessarily like having all of these illustrations and all of these things. Maybe you don't have a designer that's able to like create all these things. Um, just taking a very compelling photo of something that's relevant to the work that you do is also design. And from at least from my perspective, it's also design. It's something that's thoughtful, that was planned out, intentional. The photo on the left is of the Knowledge House, an organization here in the Bronx that does work with uh, educating folks on like tech and things like that. And like they're one of their brand colors is like this very specific purple. And in the photo shoot, we were talking about like what they're trying to figure out what to wear, and like they decided to both of the co-founders to wear these like purple shoes. And I was like, wow, that's clever, because in the photo it translates the brand even in the slightest way. It's, it was very intentional, like fashion choice. Um, and that's something like the type of photos that that you present, that use in your communication, translates a lot of things, and it does help with like building trust. If folks see images of like an image of someone smiling is going to communicate something very differently than someone with a frown. And so like being just a little bit intentional about like, okay, if we take this kind of photo, we need it to look a certain way. That's a way that you're able to then design forward in a way. And also just as an element for like storytelling. I mean, like I said, if you don't necessarily, you know not that you don't want to go the route of illustration or doing things in that way, but like you can just literally use photos to like tell a story and like to present the work that you do. And some great resources for that, I would say, is like if you don't have like, well, there's two things. If you don't have like a super fancy camera or a photographer or something like that, like don't be afraid to use some of these like online images. There are like great platforms like Unsplash, which have like user submitted photos that are high quality, and their database is pretty vast. And it's very different from like just general stock photos in the sense that this is like these are real people taking pictures that are like uploading it. That's a super great resource. And also like nappy is .co is a super great resource for like, you know, beautiful pictures. Like it says, beautiful pictures of Black and brown people for free. That's, you know, goes back to the branding and how design can be used for like accessibility and inclusion, right? Like just making sure that if you are doing work in a community that looks a certain way, that the photography and the communication also reflects that. Like how many times do we see posters for different services in our communities that don't look like the people that live here, and so they don't feel relatable and it feels out of place? And like these are simple fixes with just changing the photos. And yeah, I'm not sure if you want to add on to it, Scott. Maybe talk a bit about
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that just kind of as I was saying earlier, that in this age now where everyone has the ability to be kind of image maker, like it implies even more to photography, and like everyone is kind of a photographer, which kind of makes the photography that has kind of a professional bent to it stand out even more. It's like if you have the budget, if you're kind of thinking like, okay, where do I deploy this budget? I would say that like professional photography, professional videography, like unfortunately is not going to come cheap. But if you are able, like this would be a place to splurge versus maybe in say other areas, because I think it is going to stand out within that kind of image soup that we're all kind of exposed to. The stuff that looks polished feels even more distinct because of how much unpolished stuff there is out there. But then, you know, if you're going to take that route and you do kind of enlist a professional, try to do it in a way that's strategic. So you're creating assets that then are like reusable for you, or things that kind of B-roll that you can then rely on going forward for a while. In particular, can be like challenging to make stuff photos that don't have humans in them dynamic or challenging, and so like a streetscape or you know a neighborhood scene or things like that. You know, there's something kind of inherently compelling about a portrait that we all like resonate with. But sometimes like a photo on our phone of a storefront or of a street scene can kind of fall a little flat, and like those are moments where you can see the difference in a professional approach versus not. But you know, maybe not the most useful because a lot of this stuff is not cheap. So if you are kind of tasked with doing the photography, again, it kind of comes back to like intentionality and like what are kind of small gestures you can make that will kind of brand the photographer, brand the images, the photos and the videos in a way that feels consistent, kind of reiterates your kind of broader or fits neatly into kind of your broader identity. So it can be even, you know, something small as like, oh, all the photos are black and white, or like all the photos of business owners are taken in front of this one mural, or there's this one filter that I apply across kind of consistently. So just kind of like trying to making kind of a small gesture that infuses a degree of consistency and intentionality, because it's easy to kind of fall off that road because it's just so easy to take a photo with your phone now. So just thinking, having that kind of strategic thinking, informing how you're taking photos, and what you know what you're doing to them before you kind of publish them can be helpful to just kind of feel like it's the photos, the documentation is part of a broader kind of brand that you're building or presenting.
Yeah, and I would also say there like there's so many things like you know, nowadays like there's so many different ways that you can use photos. I mean, like just on your phone, you have like so many apps that allow you to take a photo and like turn it into a whole bunch of things. Something that I thought was like really cool that was trendy at one point was like parallax photography. And like I don't know if you've seen like the like National Geographic likes to do this where they like have a photo and then it looks like it's moving, but it's just like a photo, like a still. Like these are ways to like that you can like reuse a photo. Like you might just have a photo and now you turned it into a video. And like, you know, nowadays even with like AI, I think we will touch on it a little bit, but not too deeply. But like you can do it as well. You can have a photo that becomes something dynamic. And so it just goes to show you how like something like just having like maybe working with a photographer or a designer that also does photography, and like having this like folder of photos that you can use for different things that could on its own be like the design. And yeah, another great tool, templates. Um, I think we will talk a bit in a second also about like how, you know, this is piggybacking back into like going back to the idea of like how things can end up looking the same. You know, but templates are a great resource. And it might not necessarily even be like using a template that's like public and exists out there, but like having a template created for your organization and the work that you do. The example here I have is with the Center for Supportive Schools, this organization that I worked with several years ago, where we basically gamified their like attendance at their like high school, and they were trying to get like they were trying to find a way to like track students coming into school and not coming into school, but make it in a fun way, and then also try to see how they were doing, because some students were like at risk of like, you know, failing simply because of not attending school, and their like grades were going down. And so we created this sort of like weekly attendance like book thing with just different levels where they're able to rate like how they're feeling, the students, for the day, and you know, basically get their attendance taken that way. And they were like fun games and whatnot. But this was a template that we created for them that they were then able to use and have it printed on different colored papers, which is like what a lot of like high schools and things tend to have. And it's an example of how a template in itself could be used to like for like everyday work. Um, Something that's easy to use and modify, and that creates a level of consistency. Like students kind of in a way knew about this, and so it was like a thing. And yeah, I think maybe Scott, you want to talk about some of the resources here.
Yeah, just it's like Canva has the ability to create kind of like you can create brand guidelines within Canva. So this would be something if you're working with a designer on a rebranding or a project, something like that, like work with them to put those guidelines in place. And then kind of like if you are creating imagery or visuals within that software, you're kind of you're already working within the kind of the environment of those guidelines. So you have the colors, the type, and you're kind of you can make templates as well within that software. But like more broadly, I would say like you, much with the subjectivity about color and type and things like that, if you know that your organization does primarily work in Google, on Google Slides and Google Docs, or does primarily works in Canva or PowerPoint or whatever, what have you, you need to like convey that to the designer, and then the onus is on them to create tools that you can then use. So like they need to be able to have enough dexterity to kind of adapt to create things in the environments in which you are able to use them. So like don't be hesitant to like convey that in kind of the design process, and be clear, but like if we're going to use this, if we're going to make more stuff going forward on our own, it needs to be in this program or something like that. And then they, as a designer, you know, should be responsible for creating things that are as usable for you as possible. So it's not any of these are one, you know, some of them are more functionality than others, but the broader point is like, you know, things need to be created in a way that they're usable going forward, and that kind of emerges from the communication between the organization and the designer.
Yeah, and I'll just touch briefly upon this, specifically some of the tools you mentioned, like PowerPoint, and even like with workspaces and such. Um, we're living in a time right now where like AI is kind of everywhere. I'm not sure it's going away anytime soon. And I think like there's a lot of different feelings about it, myself included. I have my own thoughts on it, but I would say that a lot of these platforms are already adapting AI into their services and like what they do. And whereas before you would have had to have like maybe a designer to like build out these templates and specific like PowerPoint presentation, like, you know, designs for you. A lot of these tools now have like built in like AI that can do that for you. And like Squarespace, for example, they have like, if you're building a website, there's certain resources available on the site, like certain like functions that allow you to kind of like tweak the site design to fit specific needs, and that's all being done with like AI and such. And I know like PowerPoint also has the same thing where like you know, based off the information that you like share that you put, like you might upload an image and it'll automatically like kind of adjust the colors to match that in a way. And so that's something that I think should be kept in mind, that is available today. And yeah, I think that those are my thoughts on templates.
And yeah, with the AI stuff, like it also, it's kind of a fraught topic in the design world, like for obvious reasons. But like I think it should be thought of as like a tool or something that gets harnessed or deployed by the designer or by you. But if it becomes kind of the kind of the creative genesis of the thing, you're gonna run into some of the kind of bland homogeneity that you guys are maybe trying to avoid, or that maybe that you're already seeing. So trying to ideally think of it as tool versus kind of the creative source it would be ideal. And that, again, that comes with working the design with the designer at the beginning and saying, okay, maybe it's a useful tool for kind of expanding this or whatever. But if ideally the ideas themselves are still kind of have a human origin, I think is like an aspiration that's admirable and also will yield better results.
Yeah, it's like the tool will only be like is only as efficient as like what you tell it to do. And like you still need that component, and like you still do need to have that design thinking or think like a designer. I mean, when you're using it, you're in a way thinking as a designer. The type of prompts you use, if it's like something that's like written or even like generating images, that also it's a thing. But it can be like super helpful to like speed things up in a way. Um, you know, but use the tool, don't let the tool use you in a way. I guess I'll just introduce this activity. It's the next activity is what elements of your organization would benefit most from a collaboration with a graphic designer? And y'all can like add the responses in the chat. I know there's already some activity going on in there,
So
but oh, we
Joseph,
have a
there's like a
poll.
survey, a poll that people can respond to, and then after we'll look at the poll, and then we'll see if people are anyone moved to articulate or verbalize any of their responses. But
Dang, this ain't fair. Can I choose all?
you could put other all.
It doesn't give me the ability to write anything in, but I'm gonna click other.
Joseph, do you have like a way of displaying the results here?
Only if I end it. So let me know when you want me to close it, and I will display the results.
Uh, I think we're good.
Joseph, it looks like 100% of participants have answered. So I think we can close it.
Do you all see all the results?
Yeah.
We do.
Okay, I feel like this is pretty telling. I mean, like one thing BD and I that came up during our conversations in this presentation of kind of like social media platforms as kind of like a gateway to a website or more robust website, and like that's kind of for so many organizations, just because of the annoyances and the obstacles to building a website, like that kind of becomes a de facto website. And also kind of the immediacy of um engaging with an audience. So it kind of makes sense to me that that is like a popular one. And again, that's also like, that's such like a crowded landscape, and kind of there's so much to sift through. And it's often unclear like what is working and why it's working on those platforms. But that makes sense to me. I don't know if anyone wants to elaborate on why they made their choice or what was informing it. If anyone wants to speak.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I think I can solve the mystery as to why I think most people did social media. I think even if you've never did any type of creativity or graphic design work or anything of this realm, I think all of us, due to the nature of our jobs, have been forced to do something social media related. So I just think naturally it's just a numbers game. I think that's just the one that we've had the most exposure to, that most of us has been more or less forced by our roles and our job responsibilities to learn first, because that seems to have the most local impact, and the biggest need, I think, for most of us. And so it makes sense that that's the highest, in my opinion.
Thank you, Victor. That's very true. I'm curious to see if anybody who put other wanna tell us more.
I mean,
Um,
go ahead.
I chose other because I wanted to select all as well. And that's pretty much because my organization is currently undergoing rebranding, and we've worked with like two separate designers, and collectively we all felt like AI was just doing the job of the actual designer, and so it wasn't landing well. Everything was like pretty flat and
Ugh,
basic, and like we're still stuck in that phase of trying to figure those things out. So that's why I was like all across the board for me.
sounds exactly where you are. Thank you, Ebony. Angus, you wanna share more?
Um, I think I pressed the close button so I don't have it on my screen to just, go through it like how I wanted to go through it. But nonetheless, I chose other and to kind of encompass for all due to the fact that there's different facets in every I feel it kind of goes together. There's a roadmap and the end goal is a website. But I mean, not end goal, a website. The website is the all-encompassing factor of everything. Building out your physical materials is one facet, building out your digital materials another facet, building out the digital design of, the look, the feel, the vibe. Those is all a part of it. And it's all necessary. And it comes
Hmm.
together into the website where that becomes the actual being of the organization, highlighting the past, present, and future while culminating any ideas of, hey, we're starting to do this or we're getting to do this, building that engagement and support within it.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you, Angus. And I see some chat answers as well. I agree with flyers and some of those materials. And like I'm guess hearing from everybody, it's like they all kind of touch on each other in a way. Kisang, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I thanks, Renee. I totally hear what everyone's saying about the digital elements and the graphic designs for the website, social media, and we're facing kind of the same challenges in East Williamsburg as well. But we also have a huge population of older folks, a lot of immigrants, for whom like tech isn't really their thing. So we're also, from my point of view, it's also really important for our organization to try to um, make a cohesive branding strategy around printed materials, around banners and murals, little, postcard stickers or QR codes that our businesses could display on their storefronts, and trying to connect with people and become a recognizable organization through really physical and in-person means. So that's also something that's been on my mind, and that was something that was triggered with the poll as well for me.
Definitely very important. And if I'm remembering correctly, your organization has a really good passport, printed passport kind of system, which I think is really talks about what you're saying on sometimes you do need that physical thing. Michael,
Hey
go for it.
everyone, this is Michael from the Bid. So 161 Bid. So I think for us is trying to gear like every single business has their needs. So trying to figure out what template, what format works best for them. So for example, we have restaurants that have a local audience. They have the regulars, they have people who know about them. Now our challenge is to get them onto social media. Now, when it comes to our businesses who are great at social media, it's probably just trying to amplify what they're already doing. So that's a little bit easier. But I do agree with, I believe it was Keysong from East. I think it's Williamsburg. Williamsburg. I think for us is just navigating that again with our older businesses who they have a big challenge bringing in folks from other parts of the city. So I can also just say what we've done if that's possible.
Go for it.
So I know I mentioned this last time in our last convening. We just work with someone locally, like a local, actually someone who works at a bid who does videography, works with businesses already in the Bronx. So we had them do some merchant spotlight videos. Um, it was interview style, and it's you want to check out our bid and see the kind of work that they've done. It's been great, but you kind of do see the disparities for folks who know how to navigate social media and the ones that don't. Like for example, we had a business um, that had only 1,000 views on our reel because they didn't know that they had to set a collaboration. Right, having their now some of our younger businesses, that's the first thing that they did, and their videos are touching almost 10,000, 11,000. So a lot of traffic. So, it's trying to figure out what works best for for your business.
Thank you, everyone. I think we can move on from this conversation, which we'll come back to as the year as we do more work on these convenings. But thank you
I
for
just
sharing.
wanted to quickly go back to what Angus said about like how, ultimately like what we're trying to encourage is like kind of like a systematic thinking, a systematic approach to thinking as much as possible. So whenever you're working with a designer, uh the each of these elements should be kind of as intertwined as possible, and that will serve the organization in the best way possible. So like if you work with a designer and you try not to silo, or if you're giving design advice to a local business and things like that, try to kind of discourage a too siloed way of thinking. So like instead of like, oh, we need flyers for this one event, like, oh, we need to update our menu, try to instead think more broadly, like, okay, how can we create a system that then kind of like paves the way for us creating flyers, websites, social media, things like that, right? So like the more systematically you can think, and then kind of the more ways that every time you create a new thing, you're kind of constantly evolving and also like reaffirming that system. It's just going to kind of lead to a much more coherent visual presentation rather than like, oh, we need the flyers. We just focus on the flyers that look like this, and now we do the website, it looks like this, and now we're doing the social media posts and it looks like this. If you're kind of thinking of those each as islands, it's not going to interweave in the way that is going to kind of amplify your messaging in the way that, is maybe the goal here. So whenever you can think systematically like that's, and I know it can be a challenge, maybe sometimes conveying that to a local business or like that, but like try to encourage that. I think it's going to yield the most kind of like long-term results.
I kind of coin it being called like developing your tool chest. So if you develop templates and things of that nature to help your work move forward and your branding kit when you put in that time in for branding, then it will help propel your work forward when it's time to get to those hurdles or those deliverables.
Yeah, and like even with the social media, like so much of this stuff is like a volume game. So like the less you don't want to feel like you're starting from scratch every single time you have to create something. So like the more of like the stronger the foundation you can lay, the more streamlined the process will be. And then each time you make something that's kind of within these guidelines or pushes the guidelines further, like the whole thing is going to kind of continue to solidify.
Yeah, just establishing that consistency. I mean, I would say that specifically to social media. Oftentimes you see that the accounts that have the most engagement are the ones that like post the most, not necessarily the ones that have the nicest things posted. Obviously it varies from like account to account, but like the ones I would say for me personally that I feel like have I continue to engage with are the ones that are like just constantly posting and just having information that's relevant to why we're following them. So like if if your organization is focused specifically on, like, if you're a bid, for example, it might be just like, reposting things that the businesses are posting constantly. And that, like, it's just to think about design in a way, like, you can start small, but like think big, from early. So like you don't always necessarily have to have the like craziest like branding developed, but like just taking small steps that you can do and that allow you to be consistent is more important and should be prioritized over like having something super well developed and defined, but like that doesn't encourage you to like post as often. Yeah, I think we're moving low on time, so we'll just move on to the next. Yeah, that goes right into like the the key takeaways. Design is a process. Collaboration is bespoke. How you collaborate will vary on the on who you're collaborating with. Start small, think big. Scott, not sure if you want to add any other takeaways.
No, just kind of like this. I think number three is like a big one for me, and like it's like always, you'll see, even I've seen at Van Allen in these design sprints, like sometimes you'll see these organizations and they're kind of like what they come out with is like a really beautiful presentation and kind of this launch and all these mock-ups of all the ways these designs can exist. But because the designs or the system is so elaborate, it then becomes like unwieldy for the organization to implement and like continue to use. And so like I think that in when it's kind of this collaboration between professional and an organization, it's about striking that balance between emerging with something that makes kind of a big initial splash and feels like, oh, I got this professional product and this is like greater than something I could have done just fully on my own, but also something that's like tempered to a degree that it's like usable for you. And like for me, it's like the best feeling is like if I see, oh, I worked with someone on this, and then like 6 months later, they made something with this template, or they've kind of evolved something. They've kind of push the identity forward in this way or that way versus kind of like this big flashy splash, as I say here, that then just kind of like falls flat. So like prolonged kind of like slow progress is like ultimately a better path to success than like a big boom and then crickets.
Thank you guys so much for coming. And again, I appreciate all the speakers and especially Van Allen for organizing.